Okay, perfect. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, which is the aggregate demand and supply model. How was the pre-class quiz? Any comments or suggestions? Okay, so let's proceed. So up till now, we looked at economic growth, unemployment, and inflation, but we looked at them in a descriptive sense. Now in this lecture, we're going to develop a model. And the model will explain how the interactions of aggregate demand and aggregate supply will determine the level of GDP or national income and the price level. So we learned up till now about GDP, how to measure it, how to measure inflation, but now we're learning a model, and we'll see that the interactions between aggregate demand and supply will determine GDP and inflation. And so we're going to take a look at how actually these different things are interrelated. We will be using this model throughout the course when we look at various economic policies. So this is something that we will build on. So you will be using this for different things throughout the course. I guess you could think of another important question that we're going to answer with our model is whether an economy is capable of self-adjusting. So let's first talk about what potential GDP is. So we talked about actual GDP last time. I believe we mentioned a little bit about potential GDP, but even if we did, it's good to review it. So potential GDP is referring to the economy's capacity to produce goods and services. If we're at potential GDP, we're assuming that we're not underutilizing any resources. And so, especially labor resources, we're assuming that we're at full employment. So you can think of it as the amount of GDP that would be produced if all labor and all other resources were fully employed, but at normal levels of utilization. So we can exceed potential GDP by having people work 18 hours a day, but that's not a normal level of utilization. You can also refer to potential GDP as the full employment GDP or economic capacity. In our model, we're going to be considering it in our model, and it's going to be called the long run aggregate supply. Okay, so that's potential GDP. We can also think about potential GDP in terms of the production possibilities curve. Production possibility curve is just simply a diagram that shows a curve, and every point on the curve are different combinations of the two goods that we have written on either the X or Y axis. It's saying how much we can produce given combinations of the inputs in the economy. So when we emphasize potential rather than actual GDP, we're making the point that without increases in potential GDP, the prospects for sustained growth in the future are limited. What do we mean by that? Well, let's think about the point A and B here. So if we were to move from point A to B, that's a good thing. At point A, we're underutilizing our resources. And point B, we're going to be producing more and using more of our resources. So obviously moving from point A to point B shows an increase in actual production. But, since an economy cannot permanently go beyond the point, if you look at this previous diagram, we can't go beyond this boundary here, given what we have in terms of our inputs to production, then, it's the amount by which it can increase production seems to be a bit limited at that point. But if our potential increases and shifts outwards, a movement, and so if that happens, this same movement from A to B and being at B would be much more appreciated or sustainable, because now we know we're still below our capacity. So there's still sort of room to grow, or we can think of this growth from A to B as being more sustainable. So, this is just, one way of thinking of the production possibilities curve and potential GDP. The key idea is that potential GDP is what we're capable of doing as an economy, and we'd like to be operating at that point. If we look at actual GDP figures in Canada over time, here we have from 1990 to 2015. What's a clear pattern here of our real GDP growth. I want to type that into the comments. Falling, so it's increasing. So clearly there's a long run growth pattern. We could clearly see that our potential GDP definitely has been increasing over time. Now, if we look at the percent change every quarter GDP, we would get this diagram. So we can see here these shaded lines are the real GDP growth on an annual basis, and the other line here is real GDP growth quarterly. Now, we can see that it's not clearly just an increase every year and constant. There's obviously a lot of bumps here. What can we say about these regions here where the line actually fell below zero? So this would indicate that the percentage change in real GDP actually fell. In that case, what happened? Can we usually say about situations where the real GDP falls? Are we in a position now in the economy where it's likely that we produce less goods and services now, or this quarter compared to last quarter? A contraction, or we can say it's a recession. Okay, so let's move on to our model. So we're going to have a model with three important curves. We're going to be looking at the price level and real GDP space. Okay, and we're going to have a long run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve, and an aggregate supply curve. And these two, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, could intersect either to the left or to the right of this long run aggregate supply curve. And the long run aggregate supply curve is sort of our benchmark. It's indicating our level of potential GDP. So let's go into more detail on these curves. So again, we know what potential GDP is. It's essentially the total amount that an economy is capable of producing when all of its resources are fully utilized. And we're going to say that it's not dependent on the price level. If you think about it, what makes us able to have a high capacity in terms of how much we can produce? Well, it has to do with the level of our labor force, how many people we have on our labor force, how educated they are, the amount of natural resources we have, the amount of capital we have, technology. So those are the things that affect potential GDP. Prices, they don't have anything to say for potential GDP. They're more of a short-term phenomenon, as we'll see. So potential GDP, again, is going to be indicated in our model by the long run aggregate supply curve. We're essentially just labeling here what the potential GDP is. Okay, so that's potential GDP. And just to note, if we wanted to represent economic growth in our model, we would represent it by shifting the potential GDP curve to the right. So there's different ways of thinking of economic growth. In the last chapter, economic growth is the percentage change in real GDP. And, some economists might also think about the change in potential GDP as being economic growth. So forget about those short run fluctuations. If, our ability or our capacity increases over time, then we can also call that economic growth. Again, the things that affect potential GDP or the long run aggregate supply curve are the quantity and quality of labor resources. So we're thinking of, our human capital, human effort, skills of the workforce. If everything else constant, we simply had an economy, all of a sudden in our economy, people had no skills, but everything else was the same. Obviously, our potential GDP would be much lower. So labor is very important. We need tools and capital to make stuff. That relates to technology. The better we are at doing that, the better we are at productivity. Our productivity is higher the more capital and technology we have. So capital and technological change are very much related. The better we score in these, the larger is our capacity to produce or potential GDP. And of course, natural resources also play a role. And in recent decades, on average, Canada's potential GDP grew about 3% per year, roughly. Part of that is from labor force growth, and another part of that is from productivity. Okay, so the other curve is called the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, and this represents all of the firms. You could think of all of the firms' market supply curves. So it's just the total of all production that's offered for sale on the market at various price levels. Now, we could also think of it as being the total quantity of goods and services that firms would be willing and able to produce at various prices. but we're assuming, and so this is important, we're assuming that the prices of factors of production remain constant. So we're just drawing a line that shows the relationship between the price level and the amount of production that firms would want to do, given those price levels. But when we draw that, we're saying that the input costs, such as wages and things like that, are held constant. So that means things like wages or price of raw materials or any inputs to production, the price of those things are unchanged when we draw one of these aggregate supply curves. And it will be an upward sloping curves. And that's kind of easy to see. But let's first just think about what the real and nominal wage is, and then we can use that to sort of explain why it's upward sloping. So the real wage is the amount of goods and services that an employee can buy for a given amount of a nominal wage. And a nominal wage is the present day value of a current wage. So your nominal wage right now is just whatever you're getting paid. You know, if you're making $20 an hour, you're getting paid $20 an hour. That's your wage. The real wage would take that and divide it by the price level. And then that gives you a sense of how much you can buy with that real wage. So if we're thinking of the aggregate supply curve, I think of it as upward sloping. And so when we draw a curve that's upward sloping in the price level in real GDP space, we're saying that these two things move together. So then, you know, in terms of a story, we're saying that firms, if the price level increases, so from P1 to P2, for example, then it would want to produce this much more output for sale on the market. Why would they want to produce more if the price is higher? Well, we actually saw a more detailed version of this in your microeconomics class. But here it's sufficient just to think about what's going on in this diagram. If we increase the price level, but we hold input prices constant, and that's what we're doing along the aggregate supply curve, then basically we're saying that the firms are able to get a higher price for their product, but their costs are going to be remaining the same. So they're going to make more profit per unit, and so they're obviously going to want to produce more. Basically, we're saying that price level is going to increase, and that will have the effect of lowering the real wage. So the actual wage in real terms that the firms are paying the employees would be lower. And so they're making more profit per unit. And so that's the story behind why the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Does that make sense? So far we just have two simple curves, a straight line drawn at potential GDP. We have this other curve, aggregate supply, but it's the short run aggregate supply, which just shows the behavior of firms, how they would react to different price levels in terms of how much they would produce. Again, along this line, we're holding constant changes, we're holding constant the input prices of the goods. If the input prices of goods like wages change, then we shift the curve. Now the other piece of our puzzle here is the aggregate demand curve. So this is the third component, and this just represents the economy-wide demand for goods and services. So again, we're going to be drawing this in the same price level and real GDP space. Okay, and when we draw this, we're holding all other variables constant that can affect aggregate demand, anything other than the price level. Okay, so the total quantity of final goods and services that consumers, businesses, government, and those living outside the country would buy at various price levels. So we can represent this. This is a similar categorization as we did for aggregate expenditures. So we're saying that the aggregate demand of everyone in the economy is equal to consumption, business investment, government spending on goods and services, and exports minus imports. And so this is net exports. So what does the aggregate demand curve look like? It's going to be a downward sloping curve. Okay. Now, why is it downward sloping? Well, there are different reasons for that. And so again, if it's downward sloping, that means there's an inverse relationship between the price level and real GDP. So when we draw a downward sloping line in this space, we're saying that higher prices result in lower real GDP. So we're saying that everything else constant, incomes, anything else that could affect how much people would want to demand, all that's held constant except for the prices. And so everything else constant, if prices are higher, If the price level's higher, people would want to buy less. If the price level's higher, you're not able to buy as much if you have for a fixed income that's being held constant. So that's the main reason why it's downward sloping. We can think of some other effects. The real balances effect is just saying that lower wealth causes people to spend less. So, if the price levels, that's what I said, if the price level's higher, your real balance is lower, like what you can buy is less, so you're going to be buying less. Also, there is a relationship between the price level, changes in the price level, and interest rates. So if you think about a higher and higher price level, say this was like changing a lot and increasing a lot, that would mean there's a lot of inflation. Think of lenders. If you're going to lend money out to somebody, you're going to be compensated for your loss in purchasing power as a result of inflation. So the higher inflation is, the higher the nominal interest rate would be that lenders would want to charge people to borrow money. So there's a strong positive relationship between the price level and interest rates. We also have the foreign trade effect. So just to go back for a sec, so higher prices mean higher interest rates, and we know interest rates are the cost of credit in the economy. And so if the interest rate is higher, that means to borrow is more expensive. So if you're going to borrow money to buy a new fridge or car, it's going to cost you more, so less people would likely do it. And then we have the foreign trade effect. If our prices are higher in Canada, everything else constant, that would make our goods more expensive, right? And since part of aggregate demand is exports minus imports, we would have less exports as a result. So these are the three reasons why we would expect the aggregate demand curve to be downward sloping. And so this is just another illustration of an aggregate demand curve. Doesn't necessarily have to be linear. We'll probably just stick with linear curves in this course. So here, if the price level were to increase from 100 to 140, so that's saying that prices went up 40%, then we have that real GDP would fall from 10 trillion to 6 trillion. Okay. So a higher price level is associated with a lower real GDP. Here we have another illustration. The price level is increasing. That will move us leftward along the aggregate demand curve. Okay. And if the price level is falling, we're moving rightward along the aggregate demand curve. And again, it's an inverse relationship. So the aggregate demand curve represents more than just a behavioral relationship between two variables. As we'll see later in the course, each point on the curve actually represents a short-run equilibrium in the economy. A better name for the aggregate demand curve would be something like the equilibrium output at each price level. It's not a very catchy name, obviously, but that's, the aggregate demand curve gets its name because it resembles a demand curve for an individual product. But so this looks like the demand curve in micro, but there's a sort of different story going on in the back. So there's quite a bit of difference in terms of what is going on and what we're saying about this aggregate demand curve compared to just a demand curve in the regular market. But they both have a negative slope. And we'll get back into this later. Well, actually, in the next lecture, we will discuss this in a little more detail. So don't worry too much about this for now. In the next lecture, we'll actually derive an aggregate demand curve, and then we'll understand what they're talking about here. So equilibrium is where the aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect. Now, this is called a short-run equilibrium, okay? And these two curves can intersect either to the left or right of the potential GDP or exactly on the level of potential GDP. Let's first understand why we would think that this intersection point is an equilibrium. We're not just making it up. There's some good reason why we think this would be somewhere where the economy would tend to go. And it's sort of a similar idea as we learned in microeconomics about why a demand and supply curve, why their intersection in a market is the equilibrium as well. Well, the best way to think about it is to think about what would happen, the price. So I'll just go back to that slide. So the equilibrium price here is P subscript epsilon and Y subscript epsilon. So we're saying that in the overall economy, the equilibrium price level will be this, and the equilibrium real GDP will be this. Now, if we were to think of price levels not equal to the equilibrium, would we get? When we start thinking about them, that will lead us to why we think we tend to go towards the center point. So if the price level was above the equilibrium point, we're saying that the aggregate demand would be here, right? We would say, okay, at this price level, what's the aggregate demand? Well, it would be this figure right here. And this would be less than what we would find in the equilibrium. But at this higher price level, P2, that's above the equilibrium again, would result in a much larger aggregate supply. So the two groups here, the consumers and the producers, sort of have a opposite behavior when it comes to prices. Firms like higher prices and they want to supply more. Consumers don't like higher prices, they want to buy less. So the only point so let's just keep going with this price above the equilibrium. So at this price above the equilibrium, we end up getting a surplus. Can you mute your mic, please? So if the price is above the equilibrium price, we have a surplus. Now, would that be something that would persist? So you can imagine at this higher price level, there's a lot of firms that are producing a lot of output. They're actually producing more than what people want. Will they keep doing that? I want to enter the answer into the chat room so I know everyone's still there and listening. That's correct. No. So what would we expect would happen to the price level? Thanks, Paulina. It would drop. So the price level would drop. So we don't think any price above the equilibrium would be stable, and it would tend to fall. So we would go back down to this equilibrium point. But would we just keep falling? Well, what happens if the price is below the equilibrium? If the price level is below the equilibrium, we have the opposite situation. Consumers like low prices, so their aggregate demand is all the way over here. Relative to the aggregate supply at that price level, aggregate supply would be very low. And so in this case, people would want to buy more than firms would want to offer for sale. What do we get? We get a shortage. And you can think of there being a lot of people wanting to buy stuff, but there's only a certain amount. What in this case, would this still happen? Would this go on forever? There would be a strong incentive here for firms to do what to their prices? They would, there'd be a tendency for prices to rise. And so that's why we think that the equilibrium price is where the market will tend to go. It's basically where both groups are happy in terms of what the consumers want to buy will be equal to what the producers would want to sell. Any situations where you're not at that, at that equilibrium point, it's going to lead to price changes that will bring you back to the equilibrium. Okay, so now if this short run equilibrium happens to be right on the long run aggregate supply curve, that's great. That's exactly where we want to be. There's no inflation and no unemployment. Of course, there would be some frictional and structural unemployment, but this is the best we could get. We're producing at our potential GDP. However, the economy is somehow overstimulated. We get a point where we have an equilibrium that's to the right of potential GDP. And then this is the more typical case, pretty much what's going on right now in the economy. We have that the amount that we're producing is less than our potential. So the equilibrium here, the short run equilibrium, is to the left of potential GDP or full employment. Okay, so we have a really simple model here. We just have three curves, and their intersection point is a short run equilibrium. We're just saying that in a short period of time that relates to how prices change. We'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But we have these two curves intersecting. It's a short run equilibrium. It can either happen to the right, to the left, or right on the long run aggregate supply curve. So our long run aggregate supply curve is our potential GDP. You could think of that as our anchor or sort of our benchmark where we'd want to be. And it could be that the economy could not be at that point. If it's intersecting above, that's an inflationary gap. If it's intersecting to the left of potential GDP, that's a recessionary gap. So let's do an active learning question. So here I have the price index presented in the first column. Second column is the aggregate quantity demanded, each of those price indexes. And then I have the aggregate quantity supplied at each of those price indexes. So the first question is, what is the equilibrium level of prices and real GDP? So what do we look for? Well, we look for where the aggregate quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, and that will give us a price index of 100. The price level is 95, going on a shortage or a surplus. That's correct. It would be a shortage. So at a price index of 95, we would have aggregate quantity demanded of 1150, but the aggregate quantity supplied would only be 1050. So we would end up with a shortage of 125 units. So shifts in aggregate demand. So what can shift the aggregate demand curve? Remember earlier I said when we draw an aggregate demand curve, we're drawing it for, say, a fixed income level. Anything that could affect your aggregate demand, we're holding that fixed. So there's a lot of different things, individual consumer wealth, things like age of consumer durables, consumer expectations. So all of these will play a role in how much people would demand in the economy. Investment. Remember, we were saying aggregate demand is broken down into 4 components: consumption, investment, government, and net exports. So in terms of consumption, these are some things that could affect the aggregate demand. Investment. So here we're talking about business investment. Interest rate is the most important thing. There's some other things listed here that could also affect how much businesses would want to invest, like government regulations, obviously business expectations. So do you think business expectations right now in the economy would be pretty good or pretty bad? They'd obviously be pretty. Want to answer? If you were a restaurant, are you going to be thinking about investing in your restaurant right now? It's not going to be very good. So, there's going to be a lot of, in terms of business investment, it's going to be quite low probably for a bit of time. We don't put anything here for the government, but the government, there's all kinds of political things. A lot of it's political, but there's lots of different reasons why they would want to purchase more or less goods. It depends on the political views of the party elected. So in the financial crisis, the government decided to spend a lot of money, they started spending a lot of money on infrastructure projects, like building roads and highways and that sort of thing to try and stimulate the economy in the last recession. Now they're actually just giving essentially transfer payments. But there's things that can change in the realm of government that would affect aggregate demand because the government is part of aggregate demand. And then now we have net exports. So the exchange rate here is very important. If our exchange rate is devalued, that means it's cheaper for, say, people in the US to buy goods from us. And it also means that it's more expensive for us to buy goods from, say, the US. So if our exchange rate loses value, that boosts our exports, but it would reduce our imports. And so that means net exports would actually become more positive. So that would increase our overall aggregate demand. Income levels abroad are also something that can affect net exports. If all of a sudden there's a huge recession in the US, they're obviously not going to be importing as much from other countries, and that would affect us. Tastes of foreigners. If there's a fad towards Niagara ice wine, then of course that would boost aggregate demand because a lot of them would be buying it, so we'd have an increase in exports. So this is just an illustration of a shift to the right in the aggregate demand curve. So here, point A, this would be our initial short-run equilibrium. So we're happy here, at least in the short run. And then something happened to shift aggregate demand to the right. So any of those things on the last slide could have happened, and that shifted aggregate demand to the right. A tax cut by the government could cause something like this. The government or Bank of Canada decreasing interest rates could cause something like this. So anything that results in people wanting to buy more at any price level. So if you think of any particular price level, if we look at the original price level, at this original price level, people wanted to buy this much. Now they'd want to buy this much. And that's true at all of the different points. This horizontal distance here between A and B is how much the aggregate demand curve shifted to the right. So basically we're saying here that at any price level, the amount people want to buy has increased by $25 billion or whatever this could be measured in. So at the original price level now, there's going to be a shortage. And then that will tend to bid prices up until we get to the new equilibrium point C. at a higher price level and higher real GDP. So the effect of an increase in aggregate demand. So in our little model here, if we say aggregate demand increases, then we would expect to see that the price level and the amount of real GDP or income would also increase. So which of the following factors would lead to an increase or decrease in aggregate demand? So if it's an increase, then we say it's a shift to the right. If it's a decrease, we say it's a shift to the left. So if suppose there's a decrease in the stock market index, and now remember that a lot of people have their pensions and savings tied up in the stock market. So if there's a decrease in the stock market index, and so if there's a decrease in the average value of all the shares, and so many people feel a little bit less wealthy when they look at their savings. What do you think? How would we represent this situation with our model? Would we shift the aggregate demand curve to the right or the left? That's correct. We would shift it to the left. Good. What about an increase in interest rates? So for whatever reason, interest rates are higher, else constant. Now it's more expensive for credit. Would that shift it to the right or left? Does everyone say left? Yeah. So that would also be a shift to the left. Now, what about a decrease in government spending? That would also shift it to the left. So we have a lot of leftward shifts here. What about an increase in foreign incomes? So for whatever reason, there's a boom in the US. That would shift our aggregate demand curve to the right because our exports would likely increase as a result of that. What about a decrease in the exchange rate? So a depreciation in the exchange rate. So we're saying here that so if we're thinking of Canada, then in the US, they're able to buy, they don't have to give up as much of their dollars to get our dollars. So they can get a lot of our dollars now all of a sudden for a given amount of theirs. So that would shift to the right because we would expect that a lot of people in the US, some at least, would be interested in buying from Canada. If you think of eBay and you think of depreciation in our exchange rate, when they're shopping on eBay, then they're looking at Canadians who have stuff for sale on there. They get the price in US dollars. So if our currency depreciated, the price in US dollars that they're going to see is going to be lower. So all of a sudden, it's almost like you get a discount on shopping. And so they're going to be more likely to buy from Canada. And then, of course, there's other things than eBay across the board. So the exchange rate's very important. So in this case, we expect more exports. But not only that, since our exchange rate is, our dollars are worth less, we're going to have to give up more of them to get American dollars to buy stuff in the US. So here imports would fall, but exports would increase. And both of those would have the effect of increasing net exports, which is part of aggregate demand, and so the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. Now, what about shifts in the aggregate supply curve? So again, we're thinking about the willingness and ability for producers to make stuff. So any improvement in these things here, which are related to the long run potential GDP, will shift both of the curves. Okay, so if all of a sudden we have some new technology that increases productivity across the board in many manufacturing industries, so it basically it's going to be cheaper for them to produce. So, at any given price level, they would want to sell more because they can make more per unit. So if these long-term things change, then we shift both of the curves. So just think of any changes in these clearly would make it so that our potential GDP would be higher, right? If we, if our population doubled, we'd have a lot more people to make stuff. So that would be represented with a shift to the right in the long run aggregate supply curve. But also the short run aggregate supply curve, we have double the population, then, there's going to be more items that the firms would want to produce at any given price level. There's going to be just a larger economy. So anyways, when any of these things change, both the curves change. If any input prices change, then only the aggregate supply curve changes. So if wages change for some reason, that doesn't affect any of these things. So why would we shift the long run aggregate supply curve? We would only shift the short run aggregate supply curve. And so if there's, say, a drop in the price of a factor, so let's say wages were to fall, we would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. So if the input prices become cheaper, we shift this to the right. Firms would want to offer more for sale because they can get a higher profit per unit. So let's see if we can determine from these given scenarios which of these two curves will shift. So suppose there's an increase in the price of imported crude oil. So crude oil also, crude oil is used to make gasoline, and obviously gasoline is used to although gasoline or crude oil might not be used to make a can of Coke, right? The cans of Coke need to be delivered to the convenience store. So at some point, there's a cost in there related to transportation. So anyways, we have an input price that has increased. That affect the short run or the long run? Both. So it's just the short run. So this doesn't have any effect on the number of people we have, how many, our size of our labor force, our technology, or anything like that. So just the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left. What about an increase in the number of immigrants? So this is just basically an increase in the population, right? We have a larger labor force. This would be both curves, one of them. Anyone want to take a guess? It would be both. Good job. And the discovery of oil deposits in Canada. Good, both. What about a substantial increase in wage settlements? So the wage has increased a lot on average. So this again is just an input price. So it's just the aggregate supply curve. We would shift that to the left. And a microchip that reduces computer processing by 80%. So in many industries, this could result in an increase in productivity. Anyone want to take a guess? Well, this is more of a long run thing, right? So in this case, we would shift the short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply curve to the right. So we're going to talk about two different schools of thought. So neoclassical was before the 1930s. So, and it's not a coincidence, this way of thought was before the Great Depression. And after the Great Depression, there were some adjustments to economic theory. So before the Great Depression, economists had a more long-term focus. They, had this impression that a lot of markets are somewhat competitive and efficient. And so if that's the case, prices and wages adjust rapidly to a shortage or surplus. So, for example, let's look at just a quick idea of a labor market. So in a labor market, the price of labor is the wage. The quantity is just how many people are hired. Firms demand labor. The higher the wage, the less they demand. The lower the wage, the more they want. Everything else constant. And there's a supply of labor, the higher the wage, more people want to work. So markets tend to go towards equilibrium, right? For the reason we talked about earlier. If, for example, we have a recession and then the demand for labor falls, this original wage, wage zero, we will now have a shortage or surplus. I accidentally deleted the graph. Let me do it again here. I was trying to change the color. We got demand, supply, labor, wage. We had demand shift to the left. So this would be demand zero. This is demand one. And here was the original wage. So at the original wage, what do we have going on here? A shortage or surplus? It would be a surplus at the old wage, because this wage here, we would end up with a quantity supplied of this amount, but firms won't want to hire as much at that wage. And so we would have a surplus. And now so a surplus of labor is unemployment, right? So if a market can clear fast and wages can change, then we will just go towards this new equilibrium. And at this new equilibrium, we will have that the quantity supplied and quantity demanded of labor is equal and unemployment will disappear. So that's the idea. So if you think that markets are competitive and efficient, then maybe there's not much unionization or anything like that, then if there is a recession, unemployment shouldn't be, something that would persist for a long time. It would quickly get dealt with because wages would fall and the markets would clear again. So their idea was that the aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, was the same as the long run aggregate supply as potential GDP. So they just didn't have this concept of the short run being something to really be concerned about, that it would happen very quickly, and so the economy would always remain at full employment. Maybe a year or something like that, but the time that things can change would be not very long. So if there's an increase in aggregate demand, that will just end up increasing prices. So again, they just don't have a short run aggregate supply curve. You just have the long run, and the aggregate demand curve. So if you do something like, say, you print money and drop it out of helicopters, or you do anything, if the government does something to stimulate the economy, then that will just end up translating into higher prices. You just think about it intuitively. If all the firms in the economy are producing at their capacity, and everyone is, and then what people want to buy is similar to that. If you were to just increase the aggregate demand, then the firms are already producing at capacity. How are they going to make anything more? You're just going to cause shortages, and the prices will get bid up. It's like the idea of, if you think of by Sheridan, there's a restaurant that serves lunch there, right? You can get sandwiches and that sort of thing. They are already at full capacity making sandwiches. What they're able to do, they're able to meet the demand. And then something happens where the demand is doubled. Everyone going to be able to get a sandwich? No, because they're already at capacity. So either a shortage will just keep happening, but probably the restaurant would realize they could get away with increasing their prices. So the idea is that if you're at your capacity, then when you increase demand, that's just going to result in higher prices, because prices are just going to get bid up because you're going to have shortages. The firms are already producing at their capacity. But in the Great Depression, John Maynard Keynes, because of what was going on in the Depression, came up with a newer model. And in this model, he came up with the idea of the short-run equilibrium. And so, he claims that markets are not always very competitive. A lot of firms have significant market power. You have corporations in the product market, and then you also have unions in the labor market. And so prices and wages can be sticky, and they can adjust slowly, especially wages in the downward direction. Usually firms don't just lower, you could think of at your work, if the company decided to just give everyone a lower wage in a recession. Well, it's a contract. It's not that, even if there isn't a union, it's not that easy to do. It's not very practical. However, given enough time in a deep recession, eventually they could fall. But definitely it could take quite a while for that to happen. So so in the very short run, he says that the aggregate supply curve is horizontal at the price level. And that means that prices are fixed. So if you're talking about the prices of products, if you draw an aggregate supply curve that's horizontal, you're basically assuming that the prices are fixed at some level, right? And so they can't change. So if the product prices can't change, then you can't have inflation. And so he was a strong proponent of government intervention in a recession, because if you think about it, if you're in a recession, you have that production equals aggregate expenditures, but it's just at a very low level. So, for example, in the Great Depression, you were kind of in an equilibrium, right? You had that the firms were producing stuff that became people's incomes, and that's expenditures, but it was at a very low level. But something needs to happen to get out of that glut in demand. And so he says the government should intervene and make up for the lack of aggregate demand to boost the economy and get headed back to full employment. And he said his famous quote was, "In the long run, we're all dead." So if we're waiting for the long run, well, it's too long, we'll all be dead. So again, in the Great Depression, just to give you some context, the unemployment rate was something like 25% in probably the early 1930s. And even almost 10 years later, still roughly 17%. So clearly you weren't getting the neoclassical idea of the economy adjusting very quickly and getting back to full employment. It was clearly taking a very, very long time. So in the most extreme case of the Keynesian view, this would be a very short run. We just have a fixed price level at P1. Okay, so prices can't change. And so if you have an increase in aggregate demand, instead of prices getting bid up, you have that the real GDP would increase. But this, obviously can only happen so you're kind of thinking there, when you're in a recession, look how far we are below our potential GDP here. So this assumes that firms aren't at full capacity. And so if we're in a recession, firms aren't producing, there's underutilization of resources in the economy. And so if you stimulate aggregate demand, there shouldn't be any upward pressure on prices. The aggregate demand curve would shift to the right, and you would be able to boost GDP and people's incomes. So the ultra Keynesian case is, as we just talked about, we have a flat fixed price level, and an expansion in aggregate demand would just go entirely into increases in real GDP. So it is somewhat realistic in the very short run. The classical case is the opposite. So this is sort of a summary. This is Keynesian, this is like the most extreme case, and then this is the classical, neoclassical. Their theory basically implied that the supply curve was just the potential GDP, the long run aggregate supply curve. And so if you have an increase in aggregate demand, that would go entirely into prices. So in this case, the only aggregate supply shocks would be to move the actual potential GDP. So this is, realistic in the long run to a certain extent, but you're missing out on a lot of action in the short run. So the modern view would be that the impact of a change in aggregate demand depends on the condition of the economy. In big recessions, there would be a big effect on GDP. And as we get more and more towards potential GDP, the effect would be more inflationary. So recession gaps are eliminated by factor prices eventually falling. So that one of the questions we said we're going to answer is whether the economy can self-adjust. So do we need this help from the government? So we'll talk about that in a sec, because remember, in a recession, if wages were to fall, then that would be consistent with the aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. So if wages do fall, then aggregate supply should shift to the right and get us back automatically to potential GDP. And then for similar reasons, but the opposite direction, inflationary gaps would be eliminated by factor prices eventually rising, would slow things down because it's more expensive. So on a diagram, we can think of, in a deep recession, an aggregate demand won't have that much of an impact on the price level, and which makes sense because you're below capacity. So the firms are able to keep up with that demand by producing more. But when you get close to full employment and many firms are running out of capacity, then increases in aggregate demand will only lead to higher prices. So we can think of the economy acting Keynesian when we're far below potential GDP, and it acts more neoclassical when we're near the potential GDP. So is the economy self-adjusting? So if we're in a recession, so again, if the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect to the left of the potential GDP, we're in a recession. In a recession, if wages were to fall, and that's consistent with aggregate supply shifting to the right. Remember, we drew these short-run aggregate supply curves for a fixed wage or fixed input prices. So if the input prices change, then we change the aggregate supply curve. So in this case, if wages could fall, that would help clear the labor market, and our aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. But that was Keynes' argument. He's saying this could take a very long time to happen. Wages are sticky, especially in the downward direction. And so, this could take a very long time, but, it should be able to happen in theory. But it clearly wasn't working that great in the Great Depression. And it's also interesting or important to realize, too, back in those days, there wasn't any government intervention. We're used to the government jumping in. Like, look how fast the government came in to make sure they stimulated aggregate demand because of this COVID-19. They immediately were willing to spend billions. Our deficit, I think, is going to be something like $230 billion. They worked very quickly to make sure aggregate demand didn't fall. But they didn't do that back in those days. The government in those days would also tighten up their strings, and which would make the recession even worse. And they didn't have a central bank back then controlling the interest rates like they do now. So on the monetary side, immediately in most countries, the central bank lowered the overnight rate, which means the interest rates generally in the economy were dropped significantly. So they do a lot to make sure that, to try and smooth out these business cycles. In an inflationary gap, you would have, you could be in a position like this. So you're worried about inflation now. But this, inflation is going to cause wages to increase, nominal wages. And so you would think that the aggregate supply curve would shift to the left until you got back to the potential GDP, but you would be at a higher price level. So that's how we would think the economy would be self-adjusting. It would self-adjust through changes in input prices. But as Keynes said, that could take a very long time. So just as a summary, the classical solution to a recession would be just to wait for wages to change, and we would get back, so we go from here back to potential GDP. But that could take a very long time. That was Keynes's argument. His quote was that in the long run, we're all dead. So he said that the government should, get involved, increase spending, and instead of waiting for the aggregate supply curve to shift, just shift aggregate demand to the right through government spending. And there's also the multiplier effect, which we'll talk about later in the course. The government doesn't need to spend the exact amount of the gap here. They can spend a smaller amount, and because of the respending effect, which is the multiplier effect, it will it'll blow up into a larger amount. We'll talk about that later in the course. So those are the two main ideas. So that's chapter 5. So what I'm going to do is just finish up with a question. We'll do one of the in-class exercises. So can you see this on my screen? Okay, good. So here we have a table, some aggregate demand and aggregate supply figures, and then we have a chart. So the first part of the question is asking us to draw in and label the curves AS1, D1, and the long run aggregate supply curve. So anyone want to volunteer, draw in the long run aggregate supply curve? I think you can request to animate. Okay, I guess I'll do it then. Okay, so where do I draw this run aggregate supply curve? Oh, I think, one sec, I have cut out the part of the question that tells us what it is. Yes, so we're told in the question that potential GDP is currently 200, okay? So I'm going to go back here. So if potential GDP is 200, and where do I draw the long run aggregate supply curve? I want to type that in, chat function. Okay, feel good that everyone looks like they're paying attention still. That's good. So it's hard to I'm going to try that again, but it's hard to draw a straight line with your mouse. So here is our long run aggregate supply curve. Now, if I want to plot the aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, I'm just going to plot these points. So I'm going to put a point at 70 and 100 here, and 75 and 160, 80 and 200, and 85 and 230, which would be around here, and 90 is going to be 250. So it's going to go up something like this. So aggregate supply 1, and then aggregate demand, let's plot a few points for that. So, and we can look at it, we can see that it's linear, so that's good. I'm going to see if I can change the color of this. Oh, wait, okay, I found it. Okay, so for aggregate demand, we have that at 70, it is 240 here, and at 80, it's 200, that's here. Let me draw over that. Let's do 90 and 160, and then we'll just do 120. So the aggregate demand curve here, again, that's supposed to be a straight line going through here. So what's the equilibrium price level and real GDP? 80 and 200. So now it says, suppose that aggregate demand in Everton has decreased by 60. Complete the new demand 2. So if this here increases by 60, we're just going to be adding 60 to each of these figures. Okay, so we're going to end up getting, what are we going to get for this one? So this one's going to be, oh, yeah, we're going to decrease it. Sorry, not increase. I think I said increase by mistake. Yeah, so we're going to get 200. I'll see if I can. Yeah, I can't really write these in. So let's just, remember that this will be this column here. I'll give you the answers are posted already for this, so you don't need to copy this, but you'll see that this column is just going to be this column with 60 subtracted from it. So straightforward. So now if we want to show that on a diagram, it's a little easier because all we do is just move it over by the amount that demand has decreased. So we know that each of these squares is how many? 20, right? So the aggregate demand curve is going to shift over to the left by 3 squares. So we can take any point on the demand curve and count 1, 2, 3. So that would be a point on the new aggregate demand curve. And then one thing we can do too is look, we know at 75, 160, but at 70, 100. Anyways, what I was trying to do is you just look to see where this goes over by 3 points. But we can just take up every point on the aggregate demand curve, move it over 3 points, see the pattern. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We can take a point like here, 1, 2, 3. And so we can see that demand curve is going to shift over like that. So this will be the new aggregate demand curve. And so what would the equilibrium be now? Anyone want to type that in the chat? Drew things, I think, yeah, it should be 75 and 160, right? Does everyone agree? Good, yeah. So that'll be the new equilibrium price and quantity. So 75, 160. Now, is this a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? A recessionary gap. And how big is the gap? So how far are we from potential? So we can't count the 3 boxes that we went over to the left. We want to look for where this intersection point is. So the 160 minus the 200. So the answer would be 40. Okay. Now, what could have caused the aggregate demand curve to shift? Would increased exports cause it to shift to the left? Higher taxes, higher interest rates, and lower government spending? Okay, assuming the original aggregate demand curve, so the original aggregate demand curve AD1, suppose that aggregate supply changed as a result of a dramatic decrease in the price of oil as shown by AS2 in this table. So we have this new aggregate supply curve. So it wants me to draw it in, then it wants me to figure out the equilibrium values, and then it's going to ask about whether or not it's a recessionary or inflationary gap. So I'm not going to bother trying to draw that in here because it's, I think, going to look a bit messy. But I'll bring up the solution and take a look. This is a little more clear. So if we draw the new aggregate supply curve, it will be given by this right here. Okay, so this aggregate supply curve shifted over to the right. Someone give me an example of what would have to change in order for the aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. What do we hold constant when we draw one of these curves? So productivity, that's close. It's related to inputs, but we hold constant the price of inputs. Okay, so here when we draw this new aggregate supply curve, shifted to the right, and we're suggesting that the input prices have fallen. They could be wages. And so that's what would cause an aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. So now we're assuming the original aggregate demand curve, and then we're saying that the aggregate supply curve shifted to the right. And so the new equilibrium point would be right here. And so what would be the price level and quantity? It would be 220 and 75. Everyone's still there, right? Yeah, so 220 and 75. And so is this a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? It's an inflationary gap. And the difference is just 20 units. That would be the inflationary gap. Well, that concludes our lecture for today. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Next class, we will be talking about Chapter 6, Aggregate Expenditures. Take care for now.